Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast. Today, joining me is scholar, translator, academic, RPG enthusiast, and more importantly to me, returning guest and fellow Pennsylvanian, Brian Johnson. Brian, how you doing?
Still striving towards the city of Pymander in this 812th year after Mistridge.
I would like to see that. That would be an interesting mage calendar. You have like years since the founding of Islam or since the Covenant was formed or something like that. Years since the fall of Mistridge. We are here today to talk about language magic. This is kind of the other half of conversation you and I had a bit back, kind of about sacred personal texts and important occult texts in the actual world. Links to that are in the show notes. Language and the world of darkness, and specifically mage, kind of have a interesting history in that words and language seem to factor in as being kind of important in the world of darkness. Within mage, we have any number of occult languages, of which Enochian is probably the best transmitted. We have the Wulong spirit language, which is more of kind of a ritualistically presented language where the users don't necessarily know what the words mean. They just know that with great practice and effort, they can recite it. We have locations within the Umbra that tie to language. We have the River of Language, where all extant and extinct languages are present and connect and interweave with one another. So if I really want to navigate, I can start in the River of Yiddish, work back up to High German, continue back up and use that to cross over into Middle English and so on. The headwaters of that are confused but interesting. In Vampire, the Talmahi Ra have a sort of secret language called Gemalish, which they believe was the language spoken in Enoch. This is the Order of Hermes. Their version of Enochian is based on a phonetic transliteration, possibly. We have the first language in Demon the Fallen. Brian, what do you consider the cornerstone of so many beliefs that words and language are in some way magical?
Linguistic philosopher J.L. Austin developed a theory of language use, which he describes in his series of 1955 lectures, which were published as How to Do Things with Words, whereby there is an unmediated causal relationship between saying something in normal everyday speech and something else happening. So in other words, the linguistic act itself, what Austin calls a performative utterance, is the instantiation of a separate, not strictly linguistic act. A classic example of this is sanctifying a marriage with the phrase, "I now pronounce you," etc., where the verbal expression of this is what transforms the legal, social, and, depending on your beliefs, possibly the metaphysical status of the persons being addressed. An essential part of Austin's theory is a definition of the conditions under which a performative utterance can successfully perform its intended function, a key element of which is the assertion that intersubjective reality is constructed by prior linguistic acts among the participants in a given discourse. So in the wedding example, the marrying parties to some extent have to accept the premise of the whole wedding scenario, as well as the legitimate authority of the person officiating to actually make happen what they want to happen. All of which is mediated through social institutions that are themselves constructed and maintained by chains of interdependent language acts stretching back into infinity. So speech, or any language use, does not simply describe or respond to some neutral a priori state of reality, but rather reality is constructed and reinforced and also possibly challenged by every new act of communication.
So we got very quickly into semiotics, and as someone whose understanding of the topic begins and ends with kind of liking the novels of Umberto Eco, what I hear you saying so far is essentially language is a communication form that has the ability to both build and kind of activate institutions and social constructs. That the power of the Language Act is the fact that through language, we have built up a mutual understanding, at least among a small party, of what a marriage is. We have built up the idea that the officiant has the power to declare this marriage is official, and that there are a whole bunch of real-world implications tied to each of those acts. They may be purely symbolic for most people, at least in the US. When someone says, I do, as it were, they aren't married in the eyes of the state until they sign the piece of paper. So that is the fundamental communicative act in that case. But maybe in the eyes of the community, their church and their friends and family or what have you, the I do is the powerful symbolic act. But we also have the power to change and subvert that. So the implications of somebody getting married and instead of saying I do, saying sure, or why not? They are both technically affirmative responses, but they deviate kind of from a prescribed form, which very much changes the tone, feeling, and meaning of that ritual, of the marriage ritual. So it is not just that they reach a similar end state, but there is a lot of nuance and implication and so on. The idea that there are trigger words or ways of activating or unleashing an institution or a set of social changes kind of reminds me of how chiminage with spirits or umbral protocol works. Chiminage is the idea that you can create a relationship with a spirit by offering them something and then coming up with an agreement. Later on, if you call upon that agreement, you are not compelling the spirit to do it with like spirit 4 in the same way that you can compel someone to do something with mind 3, 4, or 5. But you are merely saying, hey buddy, you made this promise. The word of command is not powerful unto itself, but merely unleashes or activates that prior agreement. Same thing with umbral protocol, which is kind of the hermetic way of doing it, where instead of, again, demanding an action, you are merely reminding the spirit of what it needs to do. One request for definition. What does intersubjective mean?
Just between two or more parties.
Okay, so it is between two subjects, not between two things that are subjective.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. What do you think the implications of kind of this way of viewing language as a method of activating social and institutional constructs are?
So if the agreed upon parameters of intersubjective reality are defined through a discourse, it's not surprising that many instances of language directed toward supernatural entities make explicit reference to the identities of the interlocutors and the purpose of the communication. In order to meaningfully relate these supramundane powers to the magician, to the object of the magical act, and to the rest of the mundane world, it's necessary to verbally construct a setting where all of these different things both exist and are present to one another through the conversation itself. In using magic, people are essentially seeking to expand their network of possible social relationships to include non-human agents. So it's only sensible that we would have to introduce ourselves and explain why we're getting in touch.
I like the term supramundane as arguably the most banal way of describing magic. It is not supernatural. It is supramundane. This makes sense to me as how a animistic worldview or another paradigm that has a wider definition of person could see the world. So maybe in a materialist thing, only humans are persons, or maybe an AI, or maybe an intelligent construct of some sort. But in a lot of worldviews, you say your house is a person. It just communicates and has different wants. And in the framework you mentioned, you're basically saying, I am this person, you are that person. It is your role or your interest to do a particular thing. The role of the hearth spirit is to make a house warm. So a call to action is simply reminding it of its nature. And this to me feels like a simple spirit to mind to effect, where all you have to do is formally address the entity, establish communication in some way, and remind it of its role. And I like this because it now asks interesting questions of, so how do I communicate with a house spirit? Do I do it through pressing different buttons on my microwave? Is it something as simple as meditating and talking to it? What is the breadth of how we could communicate to a spirit? There's a little excerpt in one of the Mage novels which talks about how the spirit, I think, of fluorescent light bulbs are difficult to communicate with because they only understand the native language spoken in their area backwards. And I think you could come up with a reasonable justification saying it's due to being powered by AC current or something like that. But I like the idea that for spirits, you need to come up with a broad set of tools to be able to communicate an arbitrary idea, which is language.
The kinds of these operational contexts, which magical language has been traditionally used to construct, are often extremely mundane. The rhetorical constructions within many medieval Chinese talismans, for example, they take the form of commands to the spirits, but they often simulate the language that would have been used in official government decrees, like might be issued to bureaucratic functionaries or military officers. Likewise, Aramaic incantation bowls often framed the adjurations to the demons that they were intending to rebuke as legal formulas, some of which were identical to those which were used in contemporary divorce documents. In each case, the clauses delineating the spell's purpose are made magically binding in the same way that the language of human laws was made legally binding by the authority of undersigned witnesses. The only difference being that the appeals for justification found in spells were made to gods and spirits rather than government officials.
In Mage, we have the idea of talisman as a type of wonder that are used by non-technomantic or more mystic mages. What would a Chinese talisman look like? Do you know?
They, like I implied, they were often a cloth, paper, or even cast metal, basically a small wearable tablet with text inscribed upon it. And often also, you mentioned the secret Wulong language earlier, which I believe is based on the traditional Chinese concept of spirit writing, which is basically a untranslatable script that notionally has this magical or spiritual force behind it.
And I like this because, one, it suggests that just because it's a spirit doesn't mean we can't engage with it via contractual means, which I like. And one, because we can have these very rich evocative scenes of a member of the Wulong or another group kind of going through the appropriate rituals to write up the spirit document, the spirit manifesting and it being signed. But also that this maybe is what spirit looks like for a syndicate member, where they don't care that their counterparty happens to be the high umbral spirit of abundance or something like that. They are still going to put on their 3-piece Falcone suit. They are still going to bring their best fountain pen. They are going to have a very refined stack of PowerPoint slides that it is both interesting to see cases where the form of the addressee changes the magic and where it doesn't. And they're just like, I don't care if it's an Umbral Lord, I'm still bringing my slide deck. and this also helps us explain Entropy 4 effects, binding geishas, or similar. Within Mage, at Entropy 4, you have the ability to essentially create pretty potent curses or blessings that say if a person does this, this other thing will happen. And depending on your interpretation of M20, that can require a lot of additional spheres, or you just say that Entropy 4 is kind of enough unto itself. The contract is agreed between two parties, with the witnesses kind of being the magical functionaries of whatever entity or organization you feel kind of acts to enforce right action in the cosmos. For instance, if I fail to protect my chantry, the spirits of the celestial bureaucracy or the umbral hierarchy of Lord Talos Perdix will exact some sort of toll on me, as is their job. The contract was written in a way that they either witnessed or in a language and a form that they recognize. I like the idea that the last step of me doing this Entropy 4 procedure is I have to in some way file it. Maybe the parchment I wrote it on I need to burn. Maybe I literally have an enchanted filing cabinet or something like that, that all of the important deals that Mrs. Janice signs go in the blue filing cabinet. And essentially that is where the household spirit that communicates with the celestial bureaucracy or what have you lives. Do we have any examples of like written forms or narrative forms that are used to kind of invoke a spirit or to act or to activate a magic charm?
Yeah, there's a whole genre of magical charms that scholars call historiolae, or singular historiola, which are essentially little magical stories that impel action on the part of a spirit, a person, or a natural phenomenon, essentially by invoking the precedent of a parallel scenario in the past, which either the historical or mythical past, where some powerful individual, like a god, a saint, a biblical figure, acted in a similar manner with some good result. One that was very popular in the medieval period to stop bleeding. It was something like Christ and John the Baptist were walking in the River Jordan. Just as Christ halted the river's flow, so halt this flowing blood, or something like that.
Okay.
And this is a form of verbal magic that naturally lends itself in a mage game to practices associated with cultures bearing strong oral traditions, since those in the real world were precisely the ones that developed this kind of charm.
If you ever did a YouTube series on language, or like the story of the history of language, I would love for it to be called Historiola. So to copy this into Mage, if I am an angel magic practitioner and I wish to deliver harm unto a vampire who is far away with a Forces 3, Correspondence 3, Prime 3 effect, I could use the practice of angelic summoning and the instrument of stories, in this case a Historiola, to convince a minion of Raguel, Angel of Justice, to deliver a blow unto a vampire in a distant city. The minion asks why, and I tell the story of how God cursed Cain and all of his descendants for his sins. I relay the sin that this vampire has committed, and the angel goes to deliver justice. You'll notice in the example I laid out, even though I am using an angel as the agent of action, I am not using spirit because that is not necessarily instrumental to it. For more information on that, Charles Siegel and I had a discussion on basically when and when not do you necessarily need spirit, and I generally come down on the unless you're actually doing something to or with a spirit and it is not just instrumental to the completion of it, a means to an end, then you don't need it. Earlier, you were kind of talking about how it creates a interdependent or an intersubjective reality. And whenever I just hear the word reality, that kind of sets off alarms for me. Where do you see the language and the consensus kind of going?
From a kind of in-game meta perspective, we basically have a linguistically constructed consensus, which is perpetually created and recreated by every meaningful semiotic act, with every single person, including sleepers, functioning as a fairly powerful will worker speaking change into being. And so this could either be seen as a particular spin on the virtual adepts idea of mass ascension, a kind of nightmare of metaphysical dynamism, or maybe both. But it's definitely a solid basis for constructing paradigms that would, I think, fit equally well among the virtual adepts, hermetics, probably the NWO, doing things like neurolinguistic programming, and probably lots of others with just a little creative reinterpretation.
I like the idea that there is a group of newspeak advocates, kind of the techno-jargony, reductive, and also expansive reworking of local language that the NWO use, who believes that if language can be perfectly taught and used, a just society, by necessity, will come out the other end, at least by their definition. To me, the paradigm you've outlined kind of breaks down into a few tenets, which is just the term of art I use to help someone go from this is the belief to this is how a believer of that belief thinks that magic is instantiated. Like, to me, the role of a paradigm is to explain what is a mage and why or by what method do they get to change reality. So it becomes something like reality is created by the expression of signs and symbols to other agents in reality, which is basically saying reality is semiotic. Semiotics just being kind of the study of signs and symbols. Kind of premise 2 or tenet 2, language is the most flexible of these expressive tools. Again, you don't necessarily have to agree with it, but it is something that a practitioner of this paradigm would believe. And kind of last, by manipulating and harnessing language, one can change that relationship between subjects and one can change reality. This gets a little meta, but I kind of like the idea that one doesn't so much fire a lightning bolt as someone so much as create a linguistic construct whereby someone believes they were hit by lightning and that they kind of act that out functionally, causing themselves harm as they convulse or their nerves kind of go nuts. This is interesting to me because it very much puts clear boundaries on what the limitation of at least that basic paradigm would be until the character starts adding some sort of extensions to it. For instance, the first thing I said was other agents in reality. Other agents could literally be only other people, or as we talked about before, it could be other spirits or other types of persons. If you want to consider a rock to be an agent in reality under this paradigm, there is some appropriate way to address it to get the result that you want. It will probably be somewhat vulgar as a character literally talks to a rock to convince it to turn into a diamond that it can then use to smash through a plate glass window or something like that. There's also the idea that the communicative power of language, the language itself is somehow intrinsically powerful. So any language is going to have the ability to convey information to hopefully affect a change in the recipient. You talked about neurolinguistic programming. There are groups that could think that there is something about the sonic property and the way the hearing apparatus works that it's literally kind of a backdoor. That was kind of the plot of Snowcrash. Sure. But also we have the idea that the words themselves are somehow magical and have a unique tie to reality. What does it mean to say that a language can manipulate reality directly, and kind of what are the historical pillars that we can base that idea on?
So the classic example in strictly magical discourse of a kind of primeval language like that, which can inform reality itself, is probably Enochian, which was a language and associated alphabet recorded by John Dee and Edward Kelly in the late 1500s, which, according to the angels that they spoke to, as so Dee tells us, is the true language of creation that was spoken in the Garden of Eden, and which Adam used to name all earthly created beings. But, of course, Dee and Kelly's practices were themselves informed by a phenomenon which has been observed among many of the religious traditions that base their dogma upon a textual corpus, using text here in a very broad sense to include any kind of very precisely circumscribed, codified discourse. So things like the Hebrew Torah, the Muslim Quran, but also including the Vedas of Hinduism, which were originally transmitted orally. The inclination to postulate that this text, and hence necessarily the language in which it has been received by mortals, is eternal and pre-existing any other noetic or material reality. So the Vedas are often described as Apurusheya, I believe is the pronunciation in Sanskrit, which basically means not authored by any mortal, which whether that means created by Brahma or simply reflecting some kind of eternal truth in either case, they were transmitted to human beings by a kind of divine revelation. And the language, Sanskrit, in turn, is regarded as the most accurate, refined form in which that primordial sonic reality can be recorded, memorized, and transmitted by people. Orthodox Judaism holds the Torah to be the unmediated creation of God himself and to function as something like a blueprint for the subsequent construction of the cosmos and temporality. Also, in the Talmudic period, so the first 2 to 5 centuries CE, Jewish mystical thought produced a book called the Sefer Yetzirah, or Book of Formation, which analyzes how the letters of the Hebrew alphabet served as building blocks, which the deity then combined and iterated in order to create everything else.
The other one that's kind of bouncing around in my head, because I don't feel like the Sumerians ever get enough credit, are the Mez, kind of the divine decrees that form the foundation of social institutions and religious practice. And in some interpretations, they are tablets that kind of outline the law. But in other cases, they are a physical object. So, for instance, you could have a meh that describes the notion of what a high priest or a patron deity is and the relationship there. But another meh could be how to play a precursor of the lute or the harp or basket weaving. So there could be these objects out there that are linguistic artifacts of whatever your culture's first creatures were, that to them are to language, but to you and I are just objects, kind of in the same way a book is still an object to the illiterate, but the magic inside of it is not really accessible. And again, I'm a sucker for inserting Sumerian belief where I can. So we have the idea that there are a certain collection of words that are uniquely powerful, having been forged by the divine. This can range in belief from, well, this is the human memory of what was passed down by somebody who was contacted by something greater than themselves, to the other end, which is the received words in the order received, in the language received, is itself a divine thing. This to me gives us a pretty powerful avenue for magic. A holy text may be viewed as a conduit, literally. A mage that believes the Baha'i Kitab-i-Iqan, apologies, I do not know or speak Arabic, or I guess in this case possibly Persian, is a conduit to the unity of God and can be used to step from literally any copy of the text to any other copy on the face of the planet using correspondence 3 or 4. Likewise, a divinely received text could be used to move to the High Umbra via Spirit 3 or 4, again, it acting as a conduit, that the words themselves are magical, and even copies of them will retain that, even if there is some special way you need to copy it. Your commentary on kind of Sanskrit being special makes me think a language mage may now need to master increasingly more seemingly appropriate languages as they advance, with, say, Sanskrit being required for level 3 entropy effects, but Enochian being required for level 4. And maybe your character, to advance to Archmastery, has to spend some time going up the river of language to kind of see where the water falls out of the epiphanies from which abstract ideas or refined ideas come before it crashes down to the Vulgate, where just kind of all of humanity can access it, and they need to go through some process of creating the language or the perfect extension language for the effect that they want to do. In history, how have people manipulated this kind of primal language? How do people interface with Enochian?
So, unsurprisingly, when you start suggesting that a language that human beings have access to constitutes the very stuff of reality itself, it's a very short leap to them trying to figure out how to use that stuff to do the same kinds of things that a god does. And that's basically where we get magic. So, for instance, the methods outlined in the 13th century talismanic manual, the Shams al-Marif by Ahmad al-Buni, invokes the powers of Allah through the alphabetic analysis of his names in the Arabic language and the theosophical correspondences of those letters, while situating this essentially a linguistic kind of contemplative mystical procedure within a cosmological and ritual framework that was drawn from Hellenistic astrology, which had been translated into Arabic some centuries prior. And that to me sounds like a very Batini or Hermetic set of foci. For the Batini in particular, I think few things to which mortals have direct access would more directly grasp their idea of a divine unity than the very letters of the name of God. Whereas a Hermetic might not even be an adherent of any particular faith, but the idea of that primordial rubric for reality that can be decoded from these patterns that we find in the fallen cosmos in human language, that doesn't just fit the Hermetic paradigm, that is the Hermetic paradigm. So even if no mortal language is literally the foundational language, like as you said earlier, maybe it holds just enough of an echo of that ineffability that it can still channel the power of creation. And the same might go for a kind of data fundamentalist virtual adept, just substituting something like binary code for Hebrew or Sanskrit.
And I like the idea of a punk mage, gutter mage, or street mage that still believes in this, being able to use this language and word paradigm by using a cut-up of a holy text to kind of create a magical ransom note, which is, yes, this text is real and important and powerful, and when you say rearrange the letters of God, maybe they're doing it literally, and maybe for a larger effect they need to find a larger and larger instantiation. So for them to do their kind of apex thing, they have to find a massive inscription, like a biblical quote that has been done in marble or granite, and literally has to cut up and rearrange that text to do it. So it's like, yeah, we stopped the demon, but we defaced the courthouse. So we need to get some matter on that. Just out of curiosity, as someone who's not familiar with when we say things like name of God, the terms for God tend to be quite short. Is this a thing where it is like a full title of some sort, and that is what is being manipulated, or is it these short strings, if you know?
I believe this is in reference to, in the Arabic, 99 names of God. So they're basically epithets or titles that basically reflect different aspects of the divine unity. My understanding as a white American atheist outsider.
Yes, I feel that is us doing due diligence. So you may say something in your culture, for instance, God the most beneficent or God the most just and loving, as opposed to just being like, God.
Right.
Okay. I think for a little more variety, we can look to modifying and rearranging maybe not just the name of God, but that we posit that God has additional hidden names and each ties to a sphere. And instead of these being maybe a handful of characters or a dozen characters long, they could be dozens or hundreds. To do a Life 3 effect, I need to find the anagram of God's title as God the Sustainer and Preserver and figure out which letter combination is the one that will result in my wound being healed. And maybe I have to circumscribe the stab wound or something in it. I like this because it also gives us a natural explanation of what magical failure and paradox is. Failure, you've chosen the wrong name, and paradox, you have chosen the right name for something else, and kind of the wrong thing becomes kind of instantiated. And this kind of bridges that VA thing where we're now looking at the combinatorics of God's name. So you may have a character that is trying to reach archmastery by literally coming up with all possible expressions of a given name or title, or the idea that an exemplar, someone who becomes utterly tied to a sphere, winds up kind of modifying their own true name in some way, their own set of symbols that perfectly describes them in their worldview to match that. And that is how they integrate it into themselves. What other practices or instruments do you see language magic using?
So it's been suggested by a number of anthropologists who study ritual that magical or religious ritual action, in the way that it is able to resist contingency and disorder, basically in its reproducibility or replicability, is most productively understood as a form of written communication. So I would argue, conversely, that the magical efficacy of writing can best be understood in terms of ritual action. So if a ritual is conceptually a script of actions, fixed, coherent, timeless, and reproducible, a concrete piece of writing, which has those same qualities, is no less a potential locus of ritualized power. The modular nature of written language makes it an ideal medium through which people can project, capture in this objectified concrete form, and then manipulate their desires and fears, which is basically to say transform their personal reality in just the same way that religious or magical ritual can. And in a very universal sense, do magic. That's generally what it comes down to. And this is precisely what's entailed by the modern chaos magic practice of sigil drawing. And an early form of this was developed by the English artist Austin Osman Spare in the early 20th century, where a wish or a desired outcome is encoded into this abstract graphic figure, which is often literally a compressed form of the wish or desire's alphabetical representation written out, at which point the practitioner, typically through some method of meditation or autohypnosis, erases all awareness of that wish from their consciousness in order for it to begin basically operating autonomously through the unconscious mind, whether that's conceived of as the individual's unconscious or a kind of universal collective unconscious. Alternatively, one of the most pervasive forms of any kind of text-based magic in every culture that has produced that kind of thing just involves transposing the act of prayer from an oral to a written medium, carrying slips of paper with psalms or other supplications from sacred texts as protective amulets, for example. Basically, the inherent modularity of language makes it an almost infinitely flexible medium of description, which means that written language used to circumscribe, structure, define, and contain anything from a quality to a state of being, or even some kind of intelligent entity, as with the spirit compelling talismans or demon trapping incantation bowls, can be a very versatile resource for constructing talismanic or foci related objects.
This is interesting to me because it kind of focuses on the power of a word symbolically to be highly compact. that if a word or sound is appropriately expressed, it can contain within it so much meaning that the world kind of has to move in response. So you made mention to demon trapping incantation bowls, which, like, if you slightly mispronounce it, really sounds like a fast food item in the world of Exalted, which I kind of like. So, like, the new udon demon trapping incantation bowls are in. You're like, oh, what's demon trapping? It's just their word for really spicy. So I create this bowl and I etch the name of an entity into it or something, and I build up so much meaning or so much association with the word or inscription that when I finally erase it, reality is kind of left with a vacuum for Jadrax, he who walks and harms men, or something like that. The act of erasure creates this vacuum, and Jadrax has no choice but to kind of be sucked into that vacuum. You made mention of the chaos magic practice, and we talked about this in our paradigm deep dive on chaos magic, that you can create a word or concept that is so filled with meaning that when you erase it from your own mind, it has no choice but to kind of go out in the world and kind of become this entity. So if you need to create an agent or affect change in some sort, you kind of build up so much metaphysical power within yourself that when you erase it in that final form of autohypnosis or what have you, that the entity literally comes alive and starts walking around in the world around you. Again, this power of the expression of a word in Baha'i and mystic Islam practice, as well as I think a lot of fiberwork traditions of the far north, it is very common to craft a word into a talisman. My Matter 2 shirt that contains the runes of protection on it, or a small cloth I keep in my car with the term luck, favor, or blessing in Arabic sewn into it that grants me green lights, are both kind of very simple magics that use the power of a word to kind of focus reality. In the Three Sovereigns corpus of Taoism, there's the belief that talismans could grant insight into the nature of a thing, that it is not only a set of words, but its instantiation and how it comes together, that I could literally create a window onto the nature of a creature by creating a frame that was properly inscribed with words tied to whatever I was looking at. Another variant that we run into that is kind of a little bit aside is that the production of the sound itself is what empowers the magic, that when you hit some sort of cosmic resonance and the words are just a guide. My example of this is, a drummer once explained to me that a 3/2 syncopation kind of matched with pass the goddamn butter. What do you feel differentiates the adherence to the sound being the important part from kind of the text? Like in one case, language is merely the guide, and in other cases, language is kind of the end unto itself.
Well, this might be getting way too meta even for Mage, but the way I see it, the two different modes of signification that we see in the distinction between a magical text as a ritually empowered object, as opposed to a magical text as an independent source of power in itself, might be compared to Baudrillard's distinction between simulation and simulacrum. So the ritually empowered amulet in its textual substance is copying and kind of perpetually reproducing a ritual act, whereas the magical writing as ritual doesn't have that non-textual antecedent, and it's actually the act of inscribing it that is the magical act itself. Likewise, the onomata barbara, the barbarous names, the liturgies of meaningless vowels, the voces magicae of the Greek-Egyptian magical papyri, whether or not they in fact represent any precisely translatable semantic notionally held to be the names of foreign gods, may draw their power from the very nature of the sounds they produce or correspond to. This was actually a tenet of early real-world Hermetic thought. Neoplatonic theurgist Iamblichus in the 3rd and 4th century CE argued in his treatise On the Mysteries of the Egyptians, it's often referred to by its Latin title De Mysteriis, that the very quality of the sounds of Egyptian words contains in itself the force of the things being said. This is not dissimilar to Enochian, which, besides allowing one to converse with angels in their own language, is also imputed the power to summon and compel them, along with the cosmological forces that they correspond to. Similarly, the 9th century Arab philosopher Al-Kindi, in his treatise called On Rays or De Radis, which is largely concerned with establishing a physical theory for astrological influences and of kind of action at a distance more generally, basically different magical effects. He says that spoken words, like any other physical thing, produce these rays of influence, and their effects are largely a matter of the natural harmony between the signifying word and whatever it signifies. But their particular effects are also kind of informed by the intention of the person speaking them. And this was really a very, I guess, popular explanation for how seemingly meaningless words can affect these magical changes, because it's essentially the same understanding that was still being written down by Agrippa in his 3 books on occult philosophy 700 years after Al-Kindi.
And I like this idea that there are great words out there. And magic comes in the fact that all mortals have access to the words, but only mages, or those that are enlightened or awakened, know how to say them in such a way as to kind of put a spin on them, that they bounce off the walls of reality. Your mention of Baudrillard, I always wish... Baudrillard is in my top 10 list of philosophers I feel fit naturally into mage that I never see a mention to. Baudrillard, at least to me, is best known for the treatise called Simulacra and Simulation, which is the idea that there are items in reality that start out as having great meaning. They are initially faithfully copied, and they correctly convey some sort of profound reality. This is a sacramental reproduction. The thing itself is new, and it is also sacred. In the second stage, it is kind of perverted in some way. Baudrillard's words, masks and denatures reality with an evil appearance. Signs and images do not faithfully reveal reality to us, but they merely hint at it. The idea that there were great things that used to be around, but humans didn't know how to copy or recreate them, brings us to the second stage. It still is a reference or points to a profound reality, but it itself does not contain it anymore. In the third stage, there is no more any references to the profound. The sign is merely pretending to be a faithful copy, but it is kind of a copy with no original. Arbitrary images may be introduced. This is kind of where sorcery comes in the words of Baudrillard. There is kind of a semantic algebra where meaning is created artificially and is no longer a reflection of that hermetic truth. And the fourth stage is kind of pure simulacrum, where the simulacrum has no relationship to any reality whatsoever. It is entirely artificial, but it can contain a meaning to it. It is in a certain way hyper real. I always want to explain it in terms of the relationship between a pumpkin and pumpkin spice being completely abstracted from one another. There is no key relationship that brings from one to the other, but I always wanted to see a Baudrillard inflected paradigm, and I'm just not sure how you do it. But as a note, mostly Brian has been throwing around terms from noted authors and philosophers and so on. Brian created an amazing outline and show reference for this episode that will be in the show notes. Almost everything you say that isn't one of my improvised comments in it, there will be notes tied to it if you're like, oh, I didn't get this word, or what was the name of the text that Brian brought up. There is a hearty bibliography. One of the wonders of having Brian on is you get secondary sources, and this is why I kind of feel spoiled as a show host. This seems to be the point where we get to words as instruments, that words are a powerful stand-in or synecdoche for a phenomenon. The word lightning is sufficiently powerful symbolically of lightning that by focusing on it over the course of an hour, I can force the word to accord with my thoughts of lightningness. And as you talk about it being merely sonic, this kind of reminds me of the resonance-based magic of the Thalhun, a sorceress group who believes that the language of the Huija was created as a network of resonances and sounds to affect reality. And now kind of some questions. How do you view programming languages as a function of language? This is one of those things where I personally go back and forth as to whether or not this is either ridiculous or genius. To me, it feels like a special case of language, as we generally don't use programming languages to express arbitrary ideas in the same way that we generally don't use conversational languages to express dense mathematical concepts. And to relay them quickly, we use formulae and equations and other symbolic sets for that. Like, one generally doesn't communicate love via Python, but at the same time, like, a programming language does have the ability to describe an arbitrary state of reality, as anyone who's played like a VR game kind of knows, which makes it feel like language, but with the potential to be vastly more precise and potentially tedious. Like, what do you feel is kind of the relationship between these ideas you've expressed so far and kind of programming languages?
I think they very much are a special case of normal language use, in that one is basically defining and assembling the interacting components of a reality, albeit a very circumscribed one contained within the computer itself, unless you're a mage, according to the linguistic rules of the code language itself. So it's not so different from the cases of natural language use that we've been discussing, at least according to Austin's interpretation.
Okay, so to you, they're kind of a special case. They are very good at expressing certain things. And I like the idea that for a computational mage, we now have two things. One, if we want to do that thing where we want to express love, maybe I have to write up a computer language that is very good at instantiating and manipulating love objects in kind of computer parlance, and that I need to find a substrate on which to run it. Maybe I'm not running this on a PC anymore, but I have to create this, for lack of a better term, emotionally Turing complete computational device, and that may be a crowded theater. So I need to put on a musical or artistic performance that essentially runs the code that I have come up with to affect this change. And kind of in that way, all theater could be viewed as an attempt to come up with a programming language to inspire emotion in an audience. Are there any interesting examples of true names? So in Mage and in a lot of other Magic games, we have the idea that there are unique identifiers whose knowledge grants control. Within Mage the Ascension, in this case, Tradition's capital T, we have the Hermetics, which are quite fond of the idea that you have this unique long name and anyone with knowledge of it has the ability to find you easily, has an easier time controlling or influencing you. A thing that was kind of batted around and revised is that every magical tradition, lowercase t, may have some analog to it. So for instance, a highly karmically inclined character would see the true name as the set of karmic stains that they have accrued across cycles of reincarnation. To a virtual adept, I guess to an NWO agent, one of the easiest true names is going to be someone's social security number or their biographic or biometric information. To a virtual adept, it could be your RSA unique key or something like that. Do we have examples in world culture, lowercase t in this case, of true names or kind of true name-like things being out there?
I'm not aware of any traditions where the true name kind of changes with the individual's biography in the way that it does in the examples in Mage. But in medieval grimoires, there are, hundreds of demonic and angelic names. Often a handful of kind of synonymous epithets will be invoked when addressing a particular being, especially those that are associated with celestial or astrological phenomena, planets, stars. And these are frequently drawn from several different languages. So you'll have Hebrew and Persian names in medieval Latin manuscripts. And maybe this was in the hope that at least one of them was correct or was sufficiently close to a true name to get the individual's attention. And then demons in particular were sometimes assigned these pictographic sigils that kind of act like a shorthand signature. And it was often understood that possessing one of these and being able to basically manipulate it physically gave you a very corporal and coercive power over the demon. So like holding it over burning brimstone to kind of torture them if they didn't cooperate was a common practice. And then, of course, there are the barbarous names that I mentioned from the Greek-Egyptian magical papyri, which were often understood to be the true secret names of these various gods that had only been preserved in the Egyptian language.
And we have this as a common thing in folklore. I mean, Rumpelstiltskin is an example of a kind of a folkloric law of names where you're allowed to affect someone. So in the tale, someone gains control over Rumpelstiltskin by finally learning her name. We have a legend of St. Olaf, how a troll was compelled to build a church at fantastic speed by the saint learning its names. In Scandinavian beliefs, magical beasts such as the Nix could be defeated by knowing their name. And I like this as it kind of creates an idea, especially in children, that knowing what things are called is very powerful. We also kind of have the flip side of that, where it is considered disrespectful to name or call to an object by a proper signifier if it itself has not chosen that. There are a number of spiritual practices where it is just considered rude to mention or call out to a name that you would use a set of other associations. Your idea that just knowing the name of a demon could get its attention, we have any number of folkloric beliefs against calling the fae or the fairies the fae or the fairies. We call them the kindly ones or our cousins or the good folk or something like that, kind of to prevent from getting their attention. I like the idea that there was a group of early name language practitioners that would basically text each other by knowing each other's true names or some sequence similar to it, and basically creating a tablet or something with their name on it, destroying it, and communicating to each other from like the cosmic reverberations of a person being tied to all expressions of their own name. And suddenly we know how Shea texted with each other in the 1100s or something like that. Does sign language in any way differ in terms of magical power versus written or spoken languages to you?
I don't think it does fundamentally differ from any other language in its potential to translate what's basically a semantic code into a magical tool. I'm not familiar with any explicitly magical sign languages, but I think we could probably speculate that something like the system of mudras or ritual signs that are found in traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism could serve as this same kind of semiotic magical focus where you condense a complex magical intention behind a very simple, subtle hand gesture.
And kind of the requirements for something being a language is, does it have the ability to express an arbitrary idea? Is it in some way generally recursive, and is it kind of extensible? And it may be the case that the mudras that you're talking about, like the symbolic or ritual gestures that are pretty common in Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism, some involve the entire body, most tend to be with hands or fingers. Our mage practitioner, whereas most mortals just know a couple of signs, the mage has access to the full language, and now they are able to communicate in it. It is very hard, since maybe these things weren't written down, and it involves intense practice. And suddenly you're communicating using things that normally we don't care about. So for instance, if Brian and I are sending messages between each other in emails, unless we've agreed on something ahead of time, we generally don't care what the font is. Like, that doesn't change the meaning necessarily. It may give us some secondary meaning. If I'm a monster and I communicate entirely in papyrus or Comic Sans or what have you, it says something about me. And suddenly a mudric practitioner, it is important where your chest lays. It is important what the orientation of the body is during this communication. And the idea that there are now things your characters need to pay attention to in other characters becomes much more important. You could say that hatha yoga or breathing exercises are just a manifestation of the magic of a non-spoken language to affect the self by forcing you or guiding you into what is essentially a linguistic pose. You arrange your body in the mudra for health, which may be very difficult and may vary based on the body part. And that is how you are healing, by spending hours or days in a particular pose orientation or moving between a couple of gestures. That is how you recover from your bullet wound. We also have the idea in Demon that before the fall, there was one language, and that was spoken by all of humanity, that was shattered when God was like, no, and that any modern attempts to teach it have not ended well. Why do you think humans can't speak the first language?
Short answer, God makes the rules. But give it a more considered answer. I think that if I'm not really that familiar with the game Demon,
Mm-hmm.
so But if the first language was anything like John Dee's Enochian, which notionally amounted to the same thing, actually speaking it could have lots of unintended consequences.
Mm.
So keeping it out of mortal mouths may have been implemented as kind of a cosmic safety precaution.
Okay, so this is, you can't speak it because you don't have cosmic admin rights.
Right.
You,
And you might end the world if you say the wrong words in the wrong order.
Interesting. And maybe over time, would actually your character's version of Ascension or Reckoning is you give all humans admin access, and suddenly we can all speak the one language again. I also like the idea that there is a language that is so powerful. The hard part is not getting it to do anything. The hard part is getting it to do the right thing. So there is a slow deliberateness to even figuring out the simplest of utterances, which coincidentally is the term for the great powers that one has in Mummy the Cursed, that mages are very hesitant to use it just because it is so potent, not because it is necessarily so difficult to get it to do anything. We have the example of a hermetic in Castles and Covenants who chooses an Enochian word when they become a hermetic. Hermetics of a certain degree take a word that they feel symbolizes who they are as a person. And Brian chooses translation and I choose communication or something like that. And for the rest of our mage careers, that is kind of our guide stone. And you have the idea that you could take an Enochian word, which creates kind of some cosmic resonances as the universe is like, oh, that's what you're picking. It also has the benefit of often being able to take on double and triple meanings in its interpretation. It may be the case that there is an occult physics involved, that the one language no longer exists, attempts to speak it and poorly, like how code in one language will just not compile to program in another. The rules of reality are different. It may be the case that only the awakened can hold the true words. An attempt by others to do it ends poorly, as they essentially are struck with paradox for not having the appropriate elements, which kind of suggests that all of those early speakers of the one language were mages. And that kind of fits within the Demon the Fallen idea that there was a brief period of time where humanity was capable of great and wondrous things under the tutelage of demons. If all of humanity were awakened, that would certainly bring it along. This also creates the idea, it kind of reinforces the idea or option that the god revealed in Demon the Fallen may be closer to a demiurge, and God didn't like that everyone could do magic. You're like, yo, buddy, you're kind of honing in on my territory. The thing I run into with the one language is mage doesn't like metaphysical certitudes. In a lot of cases, it doesn't like the notion that no, this is how reality works. So it's one of those things, is that real? Is it just a story? I don't know. One thing that was brought up repeatedly by people is the chapter and verse of John 1:1 from the New Testament that is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God. I find it interesting that kind of looking into this, the word that is used instead of the phrase the Word is frequently kept in kind of Greek, because just word as we know it and word as expressed here aren't the same thing.
You're referring to it being just the Greek word logos rather than word?
We get the idea that word here is kind of kept as logos because in a number of translations it is used in a kind of a bunch of different ways. The phrase the word of God is frequently used to describe God's agent. So for instance, in the book of Revelation, we have a figure called the Word of God, which is followed by the armies which are in heaven. So the idea of like the word representing agency to me kind of feels like it's that apex of the philosophy of Austin that you had mentioned, that it is a performative utterance. And what greater performative utterance could there be than to create an entity that just kind of causes your will to be in the world? So you could now have a group of mages where referring to themselves as the words, and they view themselves kind of as agents of kind of different powers. I would love to see this in kind of a Gnostic sense, where one character considers them the word of Sophia, and another one considers them to be the word of redeemed Yaldabaoth Oath or something like that. Finally, I like the idea that, again, words are so thoroughly baked into reality that there are high umbral realms of a word, and that one can kind of, in the same way that you can sign a umbral pact to gain power from a being or entity in exchange from it, mages who don't kind of want to deal with those personifications could go to somewhere in the High Umbra where they could become the agent or sign a pact with the word discovery or truth. And just like every contract of this nature, you gain something out of it. You kind of gain a thing that you either can never do wrong, or this thing that doesn't require sphere magic to activate. But in exchange, you have to do something to maintain it. So your character chooses discovery. You gain 2 dice on all rolls to unearth novel scientific phenomenon. But on the flip side of it, you must tell someone a very uncomfortable truth at least once a week. You become the embodiment of the word death. And in the process, your ability to act as an assassin is vastly increased. But in exchange for it, there is a part of you that you must kind of ritually slay in a real and costly way at a periodic basis. You must terminate a close relationship or destroy something of personal value to kind of maintain this balance. One of the things I like about words is they give us an alternative to just kind of populating the universe with spirits. So if you want a character that thinks the cosmos is rich and vibrant with things that we cannot see and experience, you don't necessarily have to add extra people, but language kind of gives you a new avenue to add things. As another note, this conversation had a pretty hopping Discord discussion on it. I will include a link to that Discord in the show notes. For episodes, I usually leave the Discord thing up for about a year before kind of retiring it, just so we don't have this profusion of things. But again, everything Brian and I have discussed are in the hearty show notes. Brian, do you have any closing thoughts on kind of language magic, or a thing that you think people should consider, or even a direction of research for people who are kind of curious for language magic?
I would direct people to a lot of the research in fields like not just semiotics and linguistics, which a great place to start there is, as you mentioned, some of Umberto Eco's nonfiction works, but also a lot of work in anthropology has done a lot of research into basically the magical functions of language. Some of that is touched upon in the bibliography we're including. I actually have a few more sources I could add to that before it goes up.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Thanks. And Brian, if we're interested in knowing what you're up to, where can we follow it? I follow you on Twitter, at least on the Bluebird site for now. You've had wonderful commentary and insight there with just like little research notes and little nota benes that occur. Where can we find out what you're up to?
Like many people, gradually moving away from the bird site to the extinct elephant site. But under the same screen name, I'm at JOHBRI. My professional website is bjohnsonfreelance.com, where I have basically links to all the things that I've written and a whole bunch of stuff that I've copy edited for other people. And those are my main public-facing internet presences.
Awesome. Brian, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where the real magic in language is that after all these years, we still generally lose its categories. This episode was made possible by Sean Gallagher, Oracle of Dutch, the language best situated to talk about pie recipes; Benjamin Bendelow, Oracle of Saramakan, the language best suited to discuss anime; Buck Gregory, Oracle of Mandarin, the language that best conveys when a sandwich was unsatisfying; Christopher Phillips, Oracle of Walpurgi, best language for table tennis color commentary, hands down; Joshua Hillerup, Oracle of Tagalog, the perfect language to instruct someone in chainsaw ice sculpting; Neal Patterson, Oracle of Tokipona, S-tier language for LEGO instruction manuals; Jay Widener, Oracle of Yoruba, the most popular language for the Vimeo comment section; Mikhail, Oracle of Navajo, star of Macaroni Art TikTok, and the crew of Erebus, Oracle of Quechua, where we'll all be speaking that in 2024. Additionally, I'd like to thank our other executive producers: Archmaster Andrew Edelstein, Archmaster Brad of the Blue, Archmaster Dan Svensson, Archmaster Derek Semsek, Archmaster Morgan Aran, and Archmaster Patrick McNamara. Additionally, I'd like to thank Alex, Alexia, Anders S., Anand, Badurfi, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Blake Ryan, Boogers to the Six, Brandon, Bryce Perry, Chris B., Daniel Cuppen, Daniel Scribner, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Eli Levenger, Fragger Rock, George Laura, Guy Conan Stewart, Ia Bull, Jason Kennedy, Jason Vines, Jason W. Briggs, Jake Gatsby, Jeff Bryn, John Magnuson, Jolyn Andes, Laws and Stuff, Joshua Heath, Kathleen Halperin, Chris Kinner, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Proyle, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Nathan Weaver, Nibero, Nikita Klaimanov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick Mulder, Puka G, Rachel Grace, Rolf Scheinheimer, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Ryan Stray, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, William Connolly, William Martin, and Zach Rules. Our EP shoutout this week is to Brandon. Random Google searching for Brandon, at least in the US, is remarkably vague or political, so I'm going to just say that B is for bibulous, for you are very good at attending to spills. R is for retrocausality, because the future you has arranged for your current you to have amazing taste in shoes. A is for aseity, in that you require no prior existence and may even exist outside of regular spacetime. N is for the Nyquist-Shannon sampling theorem, which you never violate. D is for Duns Scotus, your favorite Western philosopher during the High Middle Ages. O is for, oh, this is going on too long. Brendo, thank you for your support. Rather, listen on YouTube. Search Maids the Podcast on YouTube to find our full library there. If you super like this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at maidsthepodcast@gmail.com or at maidsthepodcast on Twitter. We have a Hop in Discord community at discord.me/maidsthepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to maidsthepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.